So this video was literally going to be about my favorite lens for landscape photography, but it ended up turning into something totally different and nearly the complete opposite to that. What's cracking, my photography friends? Hope you're all doing fantastic. Now, when I returned from my most recent trip to Canada, I sat down to go through all my photos and edit them, and there just seemed to be something lacking. There wasn't much variation, and none of them just really stood out to me. Don't get me wrong, because these locations were so epic, there were still some really nice photos. But I just felt like I'd made one obvious but simple mistake. I've been doing photography for a number of years now, and what really drew me to photography initially was landscape photography. So you think I would have learnt my lesson now, but this mistake is a really easy trap to fall into. One that I'm sure plenty of other photographers out there are making as well, and one that next time you head out on an epic adventure, hopefully you're not going to fall into this same trap. So what is the mistake? Well, it's not an error in settings or anything like that. It more comes down to composition and is directly related to focal length. That, of course, is overusing my wide angle lens. It sounds simple enough, right? But when it comes to landscape photography, it's an easy trap to fall into, to shoot as wide as possible and fit as much of this epic landscape into our shot as possible. When we see a beautiful wide open landscape, naturally we want to shoot nice and wide, trying to capture that kind of wide sense of awe that comes from an epic landscape. Although this can still make for interesting shots, experience shows me time and time again, as well as studying landscape photography, that really compels me from others. Often the most interesting shots really aren't always the widest ones. Don't get me wrong, we should definitely still be taking these wider compositions as well, but the mistake for me comes from just overusing these wide shots. And it is easy to do. We get quite comfortable using that wide angle zoom lens especially and leaving it on our camera. But honestly, often those really wide shots, especially where there's a lot going on in a landscape, can actually be much harder to compose a more compelling composition. The reason for this is that simply because the wider the shot, often the more elements in the photo, which can be harder to place and space out across your image, but it can also just be a bit too busy or distracting when there's too much going on in your photo, without something obvious really standing out to really draw in or attract our eye. So how do we fix this mistake? Well, the answer is pretty obvious, right? But why is this a mistake that I'm still making many years into my photography journey? So on my most recent trip, I feel this issue partly came from feeling a little bit burnt out and perhaps getting a little bit lazy with my photography. But here's a few tips that I've come up with for future Tim or anyone who's watching this, so next time we head out into these epic landscapes, that we don't return feeling in this same way. You don't want to come back feeling like you've kind of missed the mark and haven't done that location or yourself justice. So the first tip is to carry multiple lenses. Now, this can be a bit of a luxury, and I know many may argue this point, but a bit of extra weight in your kit is sometimes well worth the struggle it may take to lug them up a mountain or wherever you're headed. But just think, when will you ever be back to this location again? Give yourself options and capture as many different perspectives at different focal lengths as possible. This means you can really play around with your composition and take different angles from what you might be drawn to initially. Don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that you ditch your wide angle zoom lens altogether, but play around and don't forget about your other lenses and focal lengths for different types of compositions. Sometimes we might start with one lens, take a few shots and kind of be happy, but my advice is to put the other lenses on, experiment a little bit with your composition, even if you're already happy with the shots you've already taken. Another one for me in the future is to just take my 15-35 off my camera more often. I guess it's something I really need to be aware of when shooting and just train my brain to look for these other compositions a bit more. By taking off my 15-35 wide angle zoom, it really forces me to focus on this point. I think having this variation is really important, and overall you're going to come back much happier with your photos, especially if you've got that variation and you've tried to kind of capture something new or a different perspective that maybe you haven't seen before. Lastly, remember that details really do matter. One thing I've really learned over the years is how important little details can be, not only to help tell a story, but they can make for really interesting photos. So this can often be hard to capture at wide focal lengths. Think about different textures, patterns, all those finer details within a framing that can really help express a story or show something unique. So next time we head out on our epic landscape adventures, don't be afraid to try something new that you haven't seen or done before. It might work, it might not. And sometimes you might not even work it out until you sit down to edit the photos. But really work on trying to find a unique or different perspective. Alright, thank you again for watching. Do me a favor and please do hit that subscribe button. I'll catch you in the next one. Keep on creating and keep on growing, my friends. Bye for now. What are your thoughts on this topic? You want to hit the spacebar.